Just giving it a minute before we start. Yes, yes, of course. The interface between YouTube and OBS is super weird for me because like on OBS I can see like okay, it says I'm live. I can see I can see the YouTube chat. But then on YouTube, when I try to get the playback, it doesn't show it. I don't know, it's weird like that. But anyway, not particularly relevant. Overall, today is a reading stream, so I'm not too worried about like, oh, stuff is not going through or whatever. Oops. Just notifying my Facebook page and my Discord that we are live. I don't know why Facebook and Discord do that, but whatever. Never mind, not important. Hello and welcome to the streaming Parson reads the book of Genesis. And continuing on from last week, if you're new here, I've been starting, this little reading series on my channel. I mean, my channel is still relatively new. Hoping to get some more traction, but that's not easy to do. But that's besides the point. If thank you for coming anyway. The last time I did a reading stream was last Friday, and at that time I did Genesis 4, and I spent the whole stream talking about that one chapter, because honestly, there's so much in that chapter. But for this week, I'm going to try and breeze through a lot of the early part of Genesis, because sure, there's a lot of good content when you read like the Noah, the flood story, or well, basically that, and even the Tower of Babel. But I, I don't feel like there's not as much to talk about. At least I don't have as much to say about it that hasn't already been said. And two, I want to get to the Abraham stuff because I think that's actually a great read. And on top of that, we also have all the genealogy stuff in the early Genesis, which I feel like breezing through. I don't really feel like there's a lot to say without like, how do I put this? If I wanted to talk about the Genesis genealogy passages, I'd talk more about like when they bring it up in the book of Chronicles, in the book of Ezra, as well as in the book of Luke. That's where I feel like talking about the Genesis genealogy stuff is more important. But when you're just reading Genesis on its own, maybe you're new to reading the Bible, I don't think you really need to focus all that much on reading those Genesis passages. I mean, I know some people will say like, well, every part of the Bible is important, and that's true. But I, for the sake of what I want to do with this series, is mainly talk about Genesis in its prophetic nature when it was kind of like written as part of the Pentateuch, and the Pentateuch was the only part of scripture that was around, really, right? Because of course all the other stuff, everything that happens after Deuteronomy, while that was important, in Jewish culture, they would not have like they would have viewed that as more like historical as opposed to like the life of Judaism, if that makes any sense. I know that's a very long stretch of explaining I would need to do, but I feel like if I were to talk more about that, like the extension of how the Jewish people would have viewed, the Torah and then the rest of the history books, I would probably wait till if I were to do a series on like the Book of Ezra, because I think the Book of Ezra is actually a pretty great read to understand Judaism and how it evolved as a worldview. But until then, I'm not really going to talk that much about that kind of thing. So, for the sake of that, when I'm reading Genesis, I'm going to kind kind of ignore a lot of the other parts of the Bible for the sake of trying to understand how the earliest forms of the Judaic worldview, was developed, and to maintain, the thesis I originally put in the first episode about how, Genesis was meant to always be a book of prophecy as opposed to simply be reduced to its more historical aspects, which it has been a lot in modern evangelicalism, which I think is a big failing um, in how modern evangelicals teach the Bible. But so that's why I'm going to kind of skip over the genealogy parts. I know there's a long explanation for that, but the main focuses I will talk about in the readings I will do today is basically the Noah story, the flood, and I'll talk a bit about Babel as well when I get there. So we got our work cut out for us. Especially, I might do a shorter stream because I'll probably only stream to like 6:30 Pacific time, which is just over 2 hours from now. But with that being said, if you guys want to follow along as I read, I am reading from the New International Version, or NIV. Just whip it up on like a Bible app. It's easy to get on your phone. If you're on a desktop, BibleGateway.com. It's just get it for free, right? No need to worry about picking up a paper copy in front of you, right? Just whip it up on your computer, right? No shame, right? As long as you got the word in front of you in some way, shape, or form, it doesn't matter how you get there, right? But anyway, I'm just going to start with a quick word of prayer, and then we'll get started reading Genesis. Lord God, we thank you for this day, and we thank you for this time that we have to read through your word. And I just pray that as we read through your word, you would reveal more of, your message and what you want to say to us. Even in the earliest parts of Genesis, I just pray that, you would enlighten us. I just praise the name of your son, Jesus. Amen. Okay. I gotta flip that because I don't know why I'm flipped to Genesis 11 already. Alright, chapter 5. This is the written account of Adam's genealogy. When God created mankind, he made them in the likeness of God. He created them male and female and blessed them. And he named them mankind when they were created. When Adam lived 130 years, he had a son in his own likeness, in his own image, and he named him Seth. After Seth was born, Adam lived 800 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Adam lived a total of 930 years, and then he died. When Seth lived 105 years, and he became the father of Enosh. After he became the father of Enosh, Seth lived 807 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Seth lived a total of 912 years, and then he died. When Enosh lived 90 years, he became the father of Kenan. After he became the father of Kenan, Enosh lived 815 years, having other sons and daughters. Altogether, Enosh lived 905 years, and then he died. When Kenan was 70 years, he became the father of, this is a fun one to pronounce, Mahalalel? Sure, Mahalalel. And after he became the father of Mahalalel, Kenan lived 840 years, having other sons and daughters. Kenan lived a total of 910 years, and then he died. When Mahalalel had lived 65 years, not 600, 65 years, he became the father of Jared, the guy with the most normal name here. After he became the father of Jared, Mahalalel lived 830 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, he lived a total of 895 years, and then he died. When Jared had lived 162 years, he became the father of Enoch. And after he became the father of Enoch, Jared lived 800 years, having other sons and daughters. Jared lived a total of 962 years, and then he died. When Enoch was 65 years, he became the father of Methuselah. After he became the father of Methuselah, Enoch walked faithfully with God 300 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Enoch lived a total of 365 years. Enoch walked faithfully with God. Then he was no more, because God took him away. When Methuselah had lived 187 years, he became the father of Lamech. And after he became the father of Lamech, Methuselah lived 782 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Methuselah lived a total of 969 years, and then he died. When Lamech had lived 182 years, he had a son. He named him Noah and said, "He will comfort us in the labor and painful toil of our hands, caused by the ground the Lord had cursed." And after Noah was born, Lamech lived 595 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Lamech lived a total of 777 years, and then he died. After Noah was 500 years old, he became the father of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. It might be pronounced Japheth, but I'm just used to pronouncing it as Japheth. But anyway, that's the end of chapter 5. Now, the only commentary I'm going to give about chapter 5 is when you read it, and it was kind of boring for me to read it, and especially when like a lot of the lines are exactly the same. It wasn't so much of, how do I put this? The reason why the very linear writing and how it was so repetitive is because, it's part of that whole, like, the poetic nature of how, ancient literature existed, right? Because, most of this wasn't written down, if you will. And even though, like, okay, Genesis was a later compilation, you had to have parts like this easily memorized, right? Because, I mean, if anything, if we're going to talk about genealogies, the only, how do I put this? To keep your audience when you're telling this, like when a bard tells a story, if you will, would be to make it memorable, and repetition is a great way of doing that. So by having all the same lines over and over, it would be like, okay, we know this guy came from so and so, and basically you want to try and keep the genealogy like memorized, and so you just make it very easy to remember with its repetitiveness. And it's one of those other things too that, like, when it comes to reading the Bible, and one of those other things, and it's not just the Bible that does this, but like any kind of ancient text, that most people would be pretty sure that it started out as like a more oral tradition, like people told these stories as opposed to like reading them in a book or a scroll or whatever. But a lot of things that were useful for oral tradition and bard tales, if you will, they become super annoying to read, right? And I admit that, right? Just because it's the Bible doesn't get special treatment saying, oh, there aren't things that I find annoying in it. Because, Genesis isn't the only book that does this, right? Another example is in the book of Samuel. First and second Samuel, they both do this, so I'm just gonna treat them like one book. They do the something that is common in oral storytelling, but is super annoying when you read it. And it's when like I'll give an example. So let's say like Joe Blow over here, he's been a Christian for 10 years, and he in those 10 years he's been a great example of Christian living, and he serves faithfully in ministries and faithfully in his church and whatever, and to this day he goes to whatever church. And it all started when, and then the story goes all the way back to like 10 years ago, right? So basically in that kind of story format, you tell like the end of the story in a sense, right? At the beginning, saying like, okay, this guy was doing whatever for this long, and this is how it went down. And then when you tell that part, you go all the way back to the beginning, right? Which is something we do all the time when we tell stories, right? So you might tell your friend when you're having a little bit of gossip time, you tell them, well, you know, the reason why so and so and I, we had this little falling out, and it all started with, right? So you state the current state of events, and then you go back in time. You go back in time in a sense to tell how your incident went down, right? Now, when we tell a story like that orally, you can make it flow off your tongue pretty easily, and people can catch on to that pretty quickly when you're telling them a story like that. But when you're reading it, it's like super annoying, right? And so being repetitive um, when you're speaking is useful, right? Any pastor knows this, right? A big part of when you're doing a sermon is that you want to use some repetition so that people remember what you're talking about and what you're saying. But it's super annoying to read, right? To read things that have a very repetitive format. It's super annoying to read. And I can totally get when some people like are reading through some parts of the Bible, any of the genealogy parts for sure. They have this really repetitive nature to them, and it's so easy to lose track and then like kind of like skip this part, right? But and I totally get that because repetition is one of those really annoying things to read. But at the same time, I mean, you have to remember that Genesis had to be something that people just would tell each other the stories, right? In ancient times. And so because of that, there would be these kind of annoying written moments that were designed for practical reasons in the ancient world. And the Bible's no exception to this, right? You can think of all kinds of old stories like Homer's The Iliad has a lot of repetitive um, statements used so that people would remember the story well. And I mean, people would have to be pretty impressive back then to remember that whole story, because the Iliad is not something I could cite by memory. Well, I can't cite most things by memory because memory work is pretty hard. Um, I am not the best at it. There are some people out there who can do an entire Shakespeare play by themselves. Basically, they would know all the lines perfectly by heart. I am not one such person. But I mean, to even like do something like Genesis, you know, the repetitive nature of chapter 5 could actually have you like cite it by memory. You just have to remember who's where, right? But that's the nature of the repetition found in Genesis 5, right? That's why it's there. Sure, it's annoying to read, but it has its purpose. It's basically what I'm getting at. Anyway, that's all I have to say about chapter 5. If you have any other questions, then you can shoot them at me. But like, aside from that, I have really nothing else to say. Chapter 6. When human beings began to increase in number on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of human hearts was only evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created, and with them the animals, birds, and creatures that move on the ground, for I regret that I made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Verse 9. This is the account of Noah and his family. So Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked faithfully with God. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight and was full of violence. And God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the people on it had corrupted their ways. So God said to Noah, I am going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. I am surely going to destroy both them and the earth. So make yourself an ark of cypress wood. Make rooms in it and coat it with pitch inside and out. This is how you are to build it. The ark is to be 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. Make a roof for it, leaving below the roof an opening 1 cubit high all around. Put a door in the side of the ark and make lower, middle, and upper decks. I'm going to bring floodwaters on the earth to destroy all life under the heavens. Every creature that has every creature that has the breath of life in it, everything on earth will perish. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you will enter the ark. You, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. You are to bring into the ark 2 of all living creatures, male and female, to keep them alive with you. 2 of every kind of bird and animal, and every kind of creature that moves along the ground will come to you to be kept alive. And you are to take every kind of food that is to be eaten and store it away as food for you and for them. Now Noah did everything just as God commanded him. I guess the only commentary I have to give on this is there's that weird part in like the beginning of chapter 6, and so many people people have tried to understand this weird passage in the beginning of chapter 6, why it's even there, how does it even contribute, but it's like this weird, like, the sons of God and the daughters of men interbreeding. And so, one of the funny things is that, like, the whole ancient aliens thing is popularized. The Bible did it first. It's not like the ancient aliens is a new concept. The ancient world always thought this was the case. But of course, how the ancient world would have understood it, we would say like, oh, alien creatures or whatever, right? But in the ancient world, this is what people would have called like the gods in the ancient world, right? Where these, like, what I assume would be like these far more spectacular than human entities that existed, right? And of course, some Christians would take a more rigid route and just say, well, like, demons came on the earth and bred with human beings, because that's definitely a possibility as well. But the point is that the world before the flood still had some magical elements to it, and that's a weird way of explaining it, or a weird way of wording it. But basically, the popular way of thinking in mythology was that basically there was, how do I put this, the gods, if you will, um, they they don't, well, they see, this is where, like, when well, I'm going to use certain concepts that the ancient world may have thought, but how we view it as modern people would be very different. So when I say that, okay, there were these gods that were around and they existed on a higher plane of existence. Now, when I use higher plane of existence, I don't mean the same thing as, like, a modern person may use, like, something like the Matrix, right? And how, like, a literal other dimension, moving from 2D to 3D and 3D to 4D, etc. That's not what I mean when I say, like, the sons of God and the Nephilim, right? They don't exist on that level. Not really. We're not totally sure. I mean, once again, the Bible doesn't give us much information. And really, there is not much information in general, right? It's just one of those things that, like, the world used to be a magical place, but we've kind of moved away from that, right? And this is a common trend when you read in, like, mythologies as well, right? So, um, the gods, if you will, it doesn't matter which version of mythologies, they kind of all follow the same formula, where, like, the gods breed with lesser beings, right? And then they create, the demigods, if you will, right? And when the Bible talks about, like, the heroes of old, you can think of, like, mythological characters, and this is a I don't want to really say, like, the quote unquote hot take of, like, maybe these people were actually real people. When I say, like, a mythological character, like Odin might have been a real person, kind of thing, right? That's not exactly what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that stuff like that could have existed, and is not outside the realm of possibility that there were real things like that, right? And perhaps, um, the more popular theory is that the stories about these persons survived despite, the flood, if you will. And of course, there are various debates on how the flood would have worked, right? Because there's no way you would have enough water to cover every single part of Earth. So there's a popular theory that, like, when God did the flood thing, it only covered certain parts of the world because humanity wasn't quite that huge yet. I mean, once again, you also have to compare this to, like, the number of people we have on Earth today, right? Obviously, though we don't reach anywhere near the billions categories. Heck, we probably don't even hit the millions category in this time period. We don't know for sure, but that's besides the point. But um, where I was going with this is that, other people could have survived the flood, and I mean, there's the famous Middle Eastern mythology story of Gilgamesh, right? Another guy who encountered, supposedly lived during the flood period and he survived. So, um, and the idea that, like, people survived and they would have maintained the stories of the heroes of old, if you will. And that's how other religions were born and mythologies were born, right? So, not ruling out the possibility, but, it is very possible that could have been how things went down. It's not like, any of us were there to confirm that. But what the Bible suggests is that, like, yeah, this was a thing that very well have happened. What we understand as, like, the ancient world gods would have basically been these beings that were around, right? And, when the way that the Bible words it, right, it follows that kind of track that a lot of mythologies have, right? So if we take, like, the story of, Uranus in Greek mythology and how he's like the sky god or whatever, and he, um, has kids with Gaia, the Earth, basically, and then they create the Titans, right? And then from the Titans come the gods, but then the gods are lesser than the Titans, so, like, it keeps going downgrade, and then of course the gods, um, because Zeus can't keep it in his pants, he breeds with a bunch of human women, and there's a whole bunch of demigods, right? Like Perseus, Heracles, etc. And it keeps moving down, if you will, right? And so basically, um, when a lot of people, they read this text about, like, the sons of God, the daughters of men, and then the Nephilim and all that, right? Uh, that may have been how it went down, kind of how we tell in mythology stories, for all we know, right? And then, of course, one of the the interesting thing that also comes from this passage, when you read a little bit later, is that whole like, how do I put this? God disenchants the world, right? He takes a lot of that more magical element away, which may have been the real purpose of flooding the earth. And when people talk, like, as I mentioned earlier, there were obviously other survivors, at least according to other stories, if you will, because I mean they kind of hold the same, like, that same problem with the Bible, especially with Genesis, where people say, well, is it history? Is it meta history? People aren't 100% sure, um, because the reason why it would be people would consider it possibly history is because there's a continuation across cultures that have the same story, right? So it obviously must have happened in some way, shape, or form. But then, of course, how it went down differs from culture to culture because of personal experiences, right? Um, of different persons in each culture that would have survived the flood. But I think that's the other way of looking at the flood story, is that, and I know we haven't covered it all yet, but I might as well just get this out of the way because we're talking about like the magic world going away, if you will. Because in the beginning of chapter 6, we still have the magical world somewhat, right? With, the sons of God and then the daughters of men. So they're obviously two different beings. And so the popular theory is like humans and spirit beings, right? And the more cynical view is like humans bred with demons kind of thing. Once again, these are all very popular motifs used in like science fiction as well as um, fantasy literature. It's just something we humans just can't get enough of. But reading these kind of stories. But when you read in chapter 6 and God makes that whole like, okay, I'm cutting human lifespan, so roughly 120 years. Um, and then of course like the sons of God don't really show up anymore after this. Like, yeah, they say they don't show up anymore. So I think one hot take, if you will, is that, and this is where a lot of those more cynical theories about like, well, it was demons that bred with humans, which is the cause of this corruption, if you will, that is now infested the earth and why God needed to flood it. But I guess I'm kind of inclined to go with that theory a little bit because I'm inclined to think that like, okay, the actual reason for the flood was the was to kill out the corruption, right? Not so much of humanity itself, because if he wanted to clear out humanity himself, he would not have spared Noah, let alone anyone else, right? So, with that being said, the real purpose of the flood was to kill out this corruption that came on earth, and that may have been caused by the sons of, the Nephilim and the interbreeding that occurred, as opposed so much as like, you know, just human beings in general, right? And that would also explain and why I somewhat validify, like other mythologies actually being real things. Um, and I will not rule out the possibility that they could have really happened, right? Because, and I know, okay, before I put my foot in my mouth, kind of thing. What I'm not saying is that you know I'm syncretistic in what I believe, and that like all religions are equal. I'm not saying that at all. What I am saying is that when people talk about these mythologies, I'm not ruling out that they could have happened, right? But the explanation is that like, well, since let's say the Greek gods, for example, they're not they don't fill the requirement of what makes God God, if you will. And I mean, Greek philosophers thought this too, so it's not a new idea, right? But heck, I mean, it's an idea older than Christianity itself. But the idea that like, oh, these ancient beings could have been real people, right? Um, and I'm not ruling out that possibility. I mean, that's definitely a possibility. It's not like any of us were there to confirm or deny it, but the stories obviously exist for a reason, and why they go across cultures, right? And they transcend time in a way too, right? Because in a way, it's an oral history that's maintained. And I mean, people have done that with actual history in like ancient India. So there's nothing to rule out the possibility that what we consider as mythology could have just been like a historical event in this pre-writing time, right? But going back to the whole purpose of the flood was to kind of get rid of these beings that were around, because I guess even with their magical powers, not everybody could swim. I don't know. And see, this is where we kind of find the plot hole in the theory, right? Where the theory doesn't quite hold up as well as it should. But I guess these guys with all their powers can't swim, so flooding was a workable solution to the problem. But I don't know. That's once again, this is just like people like this is just overthinking things, I guess. And you're on the streaming Parson channel. This is all about like overthinking things. Like you watch any of the you watch any of the game playthroughs, I overthink everything. So um, overthinking the Bible is no exception to the overthinking that happens in this brain of mine. But I mean, overthinking things also a lot makes life way more entertaining. Maybe I think that. Maybe you don't think that, but that's what I think. So um, anyway, um, that's all I really have to say about that. And I know a lot of people always bring up the Nephilim thing, and it is a topic of discussion that goes to like down several rabbit holes, right? But I just wanted to bring that up because I know if I don't bring it up now, somebody's gonna bring it up. So just getting that covered now. Nothing else to really say about chapter 6, because I kind of talked about the main point of it, right? The whole God tells Noah to build a boat. Well, it's not even a full boat, right? It's just like a big box that can float. Because the whole point of it is not to go anywhere, right? So it's not a boat in that sense. It's not meant to sail anywhere. It's just meant to float to make sure Noah doesn't get killed by water. So, um, I guess that's what makes it an ark as opposed to it being a boat. I don't know. There's not 100% explanation of why we call it an ark as opposed to just calling it a boat. Because technically, a boat doesn't have to go anywhere either. It can just float. But once again, that's overthinking, right? Anyways, let's move on, because I think I've done enough commentary on chapter 6. Chapter 7, verse 1. The Lord then said to Noah, "Go into the ark, you and your whole family, because I have found you righteous in this generation. Take with you 7 pairs of every kind of clean animal, a male and its mate, and 1 pair of every kind of unclean animal, a male and its mate, and also 7 pairs of every kind of bird, male and female, to keep their various kinds alive throughout the earth. 7 days from now I will send rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights, and I will wipe from the face of the earth every living creature I have made." Once again, God makes exceptions to this rule, obviously. So the whole theory of just wiping this quote-unquote corruption from the whole like ancient aliens thing could be the actual reason for the flood, because obviously God says, "I'm going to kill everything," but then he doesn't. So but of course the whole like kill every last one of them is more of an expression, unless you're Dimitri from Fire Emblem Three Houses. It might mean something a little different, but kill every last one of them. Okay, sorry, I sidetracked it there. Okay, so verse 5. And Noah did all that the Lord commanded him. Noah was 600 years old when the flood waters came on the earth. And Noah and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives entered the ark to escape the waters of the flood. Pairs of clean and unclean animals, of bird and all creatures that move along the ground, made male and female, came to Noah, and entered the ark, as God had commanded. And after 7 days, the flood waters came on the earth. In the 600th year of Noah's life, on the 17th day of the second month, on that day, all the springs of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened. And the rain fell on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. On that very day, Noah and his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, together with his wife and their wives, entered the ark. They had with them every wild animal according to its kind, all livestock according to their kinds, and every creature that moves along the ground according to its kind, and every bird according to its kind, everything with wings. Pairs of all creatures that have breath of life in them came to Noah and entered the ark. The animals going in were male and female of every living thing, as God had commanded Noah. Then the Lord shut them in. There's that repetition again. Just, in case people had to tell the story orally, they would remember how the lines went, I guess. But I just wanted to point that out. Verse 17. For 40 days, the flood kept coming on the earth, and as the waters increased, they lifted the ark above the earth. The waters rose and greatly increased on the earth, and the ark floated on the surface of the water. They rose gently on the earth, and all the high mountains under the entire heavens were covered. The waters rose and covered the mountains to a depth of more than 15 cubits, which according to the commentary here says that's roughly like 23 feet or 6.8 meters. Verse 21. Every living thing that moved on land perished. Birds, livestock, animals, all the creatures that swarm over the earth, and all of mankind. Everything on dry land that had breath of the breath of life in its nostrils died. Every living thing on the face of the earth was wiped out. People and animals and creatures that moved along the ground and birds were wiped from the earth. Only Noah was left, and those with him in the ark. The waters flooded the earth for 150 days. So basically, I assume that the 150 days was after the 40 days. Because I know some people would say that there's a possibility they overlap, right? But, I mean, I don't think on the first day that it rained, the world was already flooded, right? I think it took a little longer than one day of even the most intense rains to flood the world. So when it said the world was flooded, I assumed that was the 40 days, and then it stayed flooded for another 150 days. Just so there isn't too much confusion on time lapses here. Not much else to say about Chapter 7, really. Chapter 7 is kind of straightforward. Noah and his family got in the boat. God then put water all over the world. The boat float. Everything else didn't. So, yeah. That's Chapter 7 in a nutshell. I'm going to continue on now. Chapter 8. But God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and the livestock that were with him in the ark. And he sent a wind over the earth, and the waters receded. Now the springs of the deep and the floodgates of heaven had been closed, and the rain had stopped falling from the sky. The water receded steadily from the earth. At the end of the 150 days, the water had gone down, and on the 17th day of the 7th month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. I think that's how you say that. Ararat. Ararat. The waters continued to recede until the 10th month, and on the first day of the 10th month, the tops of the mountains became visible. After 40 days, Noah opened a window he had made in the ark, and sent out a raven. and it kept flying back and forth until the water had dried up from the earth. Then he sent out a dove to see if the water had receded from the surface of the ground. But the dove could find nowhere to perch, because there was water all over the surface of the earth. So it returned to Noah in the ark. He reached out his hand and took the dove and brought it back to himself in the ark. He waited 7 more days and again sent out the dove from the ark. When the dove returned to him in the evening, there in its beak was a freshly plucked olive leaf. Then Noah knew that the water had receded from the earth. He waited 7 more days and sent the dove out again. But this time it did not return to him. By the first day of the first month of Noah's 601st year, so basically a year later from when the whole shebang started, so Noah's a 601 year now, the waters had dried up from the earth. Noah then removed the covering from the ark and saw that the surface of the ground was dry. By the 27th day of the second month, the earth was completely dry. So basically a year and 10 days from when the flood started, the earth was now dry. Then God said to Noah, "Come out of the ark, you, your wife, your sons, and their wives. Bring out every kind of living creature that is with you, the birds, animals, and all creatures that move along the ground, so they can multiply on the earth and be fruitful and increase in number on it." So Noah came out, together with his sons and his wife and his sons' wives. All the animals and all the creatures that move along the ground and all the birds, everything that moved on the land, came out of the ark, one kind after another. As opposed to all at the same time? Verse 20. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and taking some of all the clean animals and clean birds, he sacrificed burnt offerings on it. The Lord smelled the pleasing aroma and said in his heart, "Never again will I curse the ground because of humans, even though every inclination of the human heart is evil from childhood. And never again will I destroy all living creatures as I have done. As long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will never cease." Yeah, not much to say about chapter 8. It's just continuing on the story. So, chapter 8 done. I guess the only things to really point out is, like, once again it does that whole repetition thing that I kind of sped over for the sake of memory, right? But we live in the 21st century, so we could just have the Bible whipped up in front of us with like BibleGateway.com or something. So the memory thing isn't as necessary. But there's really nothing else to say. There's the whole thing about the birds, like the raven and the dove. I know a lot of people like to make symbolic analogies with them, right? Because ravens are normally associated with like bad luck, and the dove, of course, is like a favorite of God's apparently, because everybody associates doves with like peace, right? But not much else can really be said. I mean, the story, like the story may imply that, but there's nothing really like. But at the same time, nothing really suggests that, right? Because no bad luck happens because of a raven, right? Um, it's just one of the birds that Noah has on his boat that he uses to go search for stuff, right? And the dove, and then he sends a dove, right? Like, would it have mattered what birds he picked really in the grand scheme of things? Like, God was gonna put Noah back on land anyway, so what bird Noah used doesn't matter. basically what I'm getting at is that the whole like trying to make thematic things out of animals use, and I've heard people actually make these kind of like statements about like the specific type of animal it actually matters. Um, in a lot of stories in the Bible, that is not necessarily true. I think the only exception is like when, in the garden when there was a serpent, right, and the whole dragon thing I talked about. But save for that, like there's a lot of times where ravens are used in the Bible, and in a lot of other fiction, ravens are usually associated with like bad luck, right? But the Bible basically says the opposite, right? It's not really much of a problem. It's just ravens are there. They're black birds. I mean, I guess like, and I mean, you can think of like practical real life reasons why you would use a raven to go look for stuff, right? Because you could see it. it the, if it's not nighttime, right? Like the implication is that when Noah sends the bird out to go fly, it's probably during the day, right? So if he sends a dove, is white, might camouflage with a cloud or something. But like a raven is black, you can see it, right? A crow would be as sufficient, I suppose. But crows are also annoying with a caw caw, right? But best crow imitation, I'm sure. But I don't over like spiritualize stuff like that. I don't think that's a healthy thing to do when you're reading the Bible. I know a lot of people would say like, "What? Everything about it's spiritual," which is, true to an extent. But at the same time, you know, while I overthink things, you want to be careful about how you over spiritualize and like, oh well, this crow means this, and that bird means that. That sometimes for the sake of the story, I don't think that's really relevant, right? Because once again, when we talk about Noah finding land, it didn't really matter what birds he used, right? Although I will use the little interesting trivia that the whole like dove with the olive leaf is a popular symbol, right? And people use that as a symbol of peace, right? Because I can see people associate this story with like, okay, God is now at peace with killing everybody, basically. And so the dove with the olive leaf could have been a symbol of that. But at the same time, no dove would have been a symbol of that because the dove never came back when it found land and was like, all right, I'm chilling here from now on, basically, is what the bird did. He was just like, see ya, I know where land is and that's where I'm staying, right? um, which is definitely one way of looking at it. Basically, I just try to do the Occam's razor and just take the most obvious route when it comes to explaining stuff. Um, when it comes to some of these Bible stories, sure, I like overthinking things, but at the same time, sometimes the obvious route is the best route because the less you have to assume, the better. But yeah, chapter 8. Not much else to say. Noah finds land, which leads to chapter 9. Chapter 9. Then God blessed Noah and his sons, saying to them, be fruitful, and increase in number, and fill the earth. The fear and dread of you will fall on all the beasts of the earth, and on all the birds in the sky, on every creature that moves along the ground, and all the fish in the sea. They are given into your hands. Everything that lives and moves about will be food for you, just as I gave you the green plants. I now give you everything. But you must not eat meat that has its lifeblood still in it. For your lifeblood I will surely demand an accounting. I will demand an accounting of every animal. And from each human being, too, I will demand an account for the life of another human being. Whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed. For the image of God has God made humankind. And as for you, be fruitful and increase in number. Multiply on the earth and increase upon it. Repetition. Then God said to Noah and his sons with him, I now establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you, and with every living creature that was with you, the birds, the livestock, and all the wild animals, all those that came out of the ark with you, every living creature on earth. I establish my covenant with you, and never again will all life be destroyed by the waters of a flood. Never again will there be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, This is the sign of the covenant I am making between me and you, and every living creature with you, a covenant for all generations to come. I have sent my rainbow in the clouds, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Whenever I bring clouds over the earth and the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will remember my covenant. I will remember my covenant between me and you and all living creatures of every kind. As if animals had a say in this, but whatever. Um, Whenever the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and all living creatures of every kind on the earth. So God said to Noah, This is the sign of the covenant I have established between me and all the life on earth. Verse 18. The sons of Noah who came out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan, by the way. These were the three sons of Noah, and from them came the people who were scattered all over the earth. Noah, a man of the soil, proceeded to plant a vineyard. When he drank some of the wine, he became drunk and laid uncovered inside of his tent. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father naked and told his two brothers outside. But Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it across their shoulders. Then they walked in backwards and covered their father's naked body. Their faces were turned the other way so they would not see their father naked. When Noah awoke from his wine and found out what his youngest son had done to him, he said, Cursed be Canaan, the lowest of slaves will he be to his brothers. Noah also said, Praise be to the Lord, the God of Shem. May Canaan be the slave of Shem. May God extend Japheth's territory. May Japheth live in the tents of Shem. And may Canaan be the slave of Japheth. After the flood, Noah lived 350 years. He lived a total of 950 years, and then he died. So chapter 9 is pretty short. Not much to say about it. Basically, one thing that's kind of weird to think about when you think about the flood story, and I understand when people like poke at holes in the Bible's logic, and understandably so here, where as I mentioned before, the whole point of the flood was kind of to clean out corruption, if you will. But chapter 9 reminds us something important about the human condition. And even God acknowledges it when he's talking about the whole covenant thing, that despite the fact that humans have darkness inside of them, even as early as childhood, which is just a euphemism of saying that humans will always be bad, if you will. That he's not going to destroy everybody, right? Despite the fact that we have this inclination of darkness. But the chapter 9 story just kind of plays that out, right? Because what does Noah do? Basically, shortly after he's been spared by God, he goes and gets himself drunk, right? So it just really shows that human beings are, pretty pathetic in the grand scheme of things, right? And I mean, the Bible does this over and over to remind us that, we're actually pretty bad at a lot of things, and it's kind of just the way it is on one hand. But on the other hand, from a narrative perspective, in the grand scheme of the Bible, which I am breaking my own rule that I set up when I said that we would talk about Genesis mostly on its own, but and we'll see this throughout more parts of Genesis, so I'm kind of giving you a foreshadow of that too. But the Bible, not just Genesis, but the entirety of it does talk about how, like, the reason why we need a savior is because of how much inclination to evil that we have, right? No matter who you are, right? So I remember um, there was a guy. Well, he's a relatively known name on YouTube. Uh, he's not a famous YouTuber exactly, but he's known on here. It's Dennis Prager, and he pointed out something about Jewish grammar, or Hebrew grammar would be more accurate to call it. But the whole part about Noah being good in his generation, right? And this was said, I think it's in the beginning of chapter 7. Let me just find. I make sure I'm not misquoting. Um, I want to make sure I'm not misquoting the exact passage. It's the one where it says Noah was the righteous man in his generation. It's yeah, it is the beginning of chapter 7. So in chapter 7, said, "Go into the ark, you and your whole family, because I have found you righteous in this generation." So so there's something interesting to think about that particular passage, and as Prager correctly points out, the Bible could have simply said you are a righteous man, period. But why does it go to say you're a righteous man in this generation? And the fact of the matter is, one, the Bible is aware of Ubermensch mentality, which is the idea that as we move later generations, we are supposedly, but not always, um, to be more moral than the previous generation, because the idea is that we build from the mistakes, we learn from the mistakes of past generations. We ought to improve ourselves. That was the point of the Ubermensch mentality. But of course, that not always the case, right? We're not always better than previous generations. That's not always the case. But the point here is that just because Noah was good in his generation doesn't mean he's one objectively good, because once again, as Jesus will point out, no one is truly good, right? um, which is the whole, like, the reason we need a savior is because none of us are good. And then Paul reiterates that, right? All of us have fallen short of the glory of God, right? Which is ultimately um, how we have all sinned, right? We've all fallen short of the glory of God. But going back here with Noah, right? And it just shows, right? Like, sure, he may have been the quote unquote righteous in his generation, but that doesn't really mean much, right? Because people, one, have this innate darkness and inclination to evil. And so, with that being said, Noah, when he's off the boat, he immediately just does regular people things, but it ends up getting him in trouble pretty quickly, right? He becomes an embarrassment to his sons, right? And of course, and that's the reason why Ham is cursed, by the way, right? Where people would read, well, why does God curse Ham for seeing his father naked, right? It's because you shouldn't laugh at someone else being an embarrassment, right? You should, instead of stooping down, you should be the better person, right? And so Ham doesn't do that. That's kind of what the story implies. That Noah was a bit of an embarrassment um, in getting himself basically drunk right away, right? He's an embarrassment. So really, he's not that good a guy, right? And going back to the whole Ubermensch thing, his sons should be better people than he is. That's kind of how the Ubermensch philosophy works, right? And the Ubermensch mentality works. His sons should be better people, but Ham doesn't show that. He shows that he's actually, just as much, if not more, of an asshole than his dad is. So he laughs at his dad being an idiot. But if you really are the morally superior person, maybe you shouldn't be so quick to judge and make fun of people just because they're not as good as you are, right? And so Ham clearly fails that, whereas the two other brothers show that no, we're going to help him out and be respectful about it. We're not going to laugh at the fact that our dad has been an embarrassment, right? We're going to still treat him with dignity, which is kind of that whole ritual right? And I call it a ritual, right? Of the how they cover, they enter backward, they walk in the tent backwards, and they cover their dad without looking at his naked body. Um, and in a sense, it's a ritualized event because it is a symbol of how we ought to treat people that are that behave in embarrassing ways, right? And when I say embarrassing, I don't just mean like, oh, it's a little silly and they, um, they're little people become, twice bitten, right? Um, but going back with, the whole ritualizing part of the covering is to show that it shows a part of their character, even though these guys don't have very many passages, right? But it does show a lot of their character and how future generations ought to live, right? We ought not to live by to laugh at the embarrassment of previous generations. Now, here's my hot take of the day, because I'm pretty sure some of you may like hot takes, and the only reason why you'd watch a streaming Parson would be for a hot take, right? But I think this is why you know one of the problems in our current time period is that we have taken the more ham approach as opposed to the older brothers approach, and that is that we basically go around laughing at the embarrassment the previous generations were, right? So there's an old saying, right? Let bygones be bygones, right? But for some reason, our generation, when I say our generation, I mean like, uh, millennials like myself. Even though, yes, I am aware on Throwback Thursdays, I make fun of myself being called boomer. But in actuality, by definition, I'm a millennial. So millennials, mostly millennials really, because, and some Gen Zers, but you don't see it as much because most of them are still pretty young. And as a millennial, we're kind of douches and don't listen to Gen Zers anyways. Um, but most millennials and Gen Zers were too busy looking at previous generations and calling them out on them being embarrassments, as opposed to us living as better people. Now, I know some people may disagree on that and say, well, no, we're here to fight, end racism or whatever. But in a lot of ways, that's not what we really see, right? We're sure that may be our quote unquote goal is to do something like end racism or whatever. But more often than not, we're too busy calling out previous generations on their failure, right? We're too busy calling out the past for being an embarrassment, as opposed to actually moving forward and, doing the things we should to be better people, right? And I think that's where, a lot of, all the political unrest comes from, right? Because we're too busy looking at the past as an embarrassment, as opposed to looking to the future of what we can do better. Um, Now, of course, some of you may call me out and say, "Well, we have to look at the past in order to know how to move in the future." That's true, but at the same time, you know, you don't need to dwell on the past either, right? We don't need to keep pointing at the past and say embarrassment over and over, right? There's only so much of that you can do, right? Like stop, right? Let's move forward now. Let's think about how to move forward, as opposed to just looking to the past and calling it an embarrassment. Um, which is something that the Bible is very clear on doing, right? It's about, you know, becoming a new creation, as Paul would say it. It's about, how God can change us for the future as opposed to us dwelling in the past, right? And I think that's something that this story is meant to tell us, right? I mean, why bother telling the story about when Noah gets drunk, right? But I think there's that contrast of Noah being righteous in his generation, which apparently, according to the previous passages, is not much of a benchmark, right? So, and then of course in chapter 9, where Noah does something basically really idiotic as soon as they get off the boat, right? Um, so, but at the same time, the the three sons and how they react really shows how we should react when we look at our own histories, right? So that's my hot take with chapter 9, which I'm surprised I had more to say about than I thought I did. But, that's chapter 9. I'm just looking at time here. We're at 5:30, and I do want to end it sooner than later. So I am going to breeze through chapter 10 because there's really not much in chapter 10. It's like poems and stuff, and then a little bit of genealogy. And then chapter 11 has the Tower of Babel and more genealogy. So the genealogy parts I will skip over. I'll move through them pretty quickly, and I won't have much commentary. Aside from stuff I said earlier, the whole repetition thing. But then, of course, I will talk a bit about Babel, just because there's a little bit of interesting things to talk about it. But save for that, basically what I'm telling you now is that we're going to blow through these next 2 chapters as fast as we can and try and finish at around 6 o'clock Pacific time, or basically my time zone, which is half an hour from now. So let's go. Chapter 10. This is the account of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Noah's sons, who themselves had sons after the flood, obviously. The Japhethites. The sons of Japheth, Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshach, and Tiras. Tiras? I think it's Tiras. I don't know why I emphasize it Tiras. Tiras. The sons of Gomer, Ashkenaz, Riphath, and Torgamah. Yes, genealogy chapters are so fun to read because of all these super hard names to pronounce. And the sons of Javan, Elisha, Tarshish, the Kittites, and the Rodanites. From these, the maritime peoples spread out into their territories by the clans within their nations, each with its own language. Verse 6. The sons of Ham, Cush, Egypt, Put, and Canaan. Oh, at least those are easy to pronounce. The sons of Cush, Seba, Havilah, Sabta, Rama, and Sebteka. And the sons of Rama, Sheba, and Dedan. I think it's Dedan, actually. Cush was the father of Nimrod, who became a mighty warrior on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. That is why it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. My assumption is that Nimrod is a great mythological character that has taken up many different names throughout the places he went to. And I talked about this, with the whole Nephilim thing earlier. And basically, we have this irony here with Nimrod that really, in a weird way, the flooding didn't really do that much because, we're just restarting the cycle, if you will, in the grand scheme of things. But, Nimrod may have had different names across different regions, and thus, in mythologies, Nimrod could have existed in different mythologies and different cultures, and may have just taken up different names. But basically, the short and short of it is that he's this super badass hunter and warrior of basically little to no equal among men, and thus would have been viewed as a god, basically. The first, verse 10. The first centers of his kingdom, Nimrod, were Babylon, Uruk, Akkad, and Calneh in Shinar. I think that's how you say that. From the land he went to Assyria, where he built Nineveh, Rehoboth, but don't get it confused with a different we're going to talk about. Calah, and Rezin, which is between Nineveh and Calah, the great city. Now Egypt was the father of Ludites, Anamites, Lehabites, Naphutites, Pathrusites, Casluhites, from where the Philistines come from, and Caphtorites. Gotta love these names. And Canaan was the father of Sidon, his firstborn, and of the Hittites, Jebusites, Amorites, Girgashites, Hivites, Arkites, Sinites, Arvadites, Zemorites, and Hamathites. I think I got them all. Later, the Canaanite clans scattered, and the borders of Canaan reached from Sidon toward Gerar as far as Gaza, and then towards Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, and Zeboim as far as Lasha. I don't know why I said that way. These are the sons of Ham by their clans and languages in their territories and nations. Boy howdy, we got one more son to go through, which means more fun names. Brace yourselves. Sons were also born to Shem, whose older brother was Japheth. Shem was the ancestor of all the sons of Eber. The sons of Shem: Elam, Sure. Elam, Ashur, Arphaxad, which is a badass name, by the way. Arphaxad, Lud, and Aram. The sons of Aram: Uz, Hul, Gether, and Meshach. Arphaxad was the father of Shelah, and Shelah the father of Eber. Now there were two sons born to Eber. And one of them was named Peleg, because in his time the earth was divided. And Peleg's brother was named Joktan. Now Joktan was the father of Almodad, Sheleph, Hazarmaveth, Jerah, Hadaram, Uzal, Dikla, Obal, Abimael, Sheba, Ophir, Havilah, and Jobab. And all these were the sons of Joktan. The region where they lived stretched from Mesha towards Separ, in the eastern hill country. These are the sons by Shem by their clans, and languages in their territories and nations. These are the clans of Noah's sons, according to their lines of descent, within their nations. From these, the nations spread over the earth after the flood. So yeah, chapter 11. Not much to say about it. Just a lot of names of different dudes. I guess the only ones that are really noteworthy are like the Hamites, because of course some of these guys will show up as enemies of Israel later. Which I guess kind of has like that whole like fable element to it, right? Of how we came to be enemies with these other people. And basically it was like, well, way back in the earliest of our ancestry kind of thing. And so that kind of happens here. And so the Hamites, a lot of them, you know, like the Philistines come from them, the Ammonites, the Canaanites, you know, all these people that the Israelites later have to fight. They come from this line, right? And the Israelites come from another line, which we'll get to later. But there is a little bit of that fable element in this chapter. I just wanted to point that out. Why even bother with these names, right? But the Japheth one is kind of like, yeah, whatever, right? They're kind of around. And they are people that are mentioned later, but not very much, and really not for much of a reason. So, whatever, right? Japhethites, kind of like... And even most of the Shemites are like, whatever. We don't really care that much about these guys. They're just, you know, just these crazy names. And imagine like being an ancient bard, having to tell this story by memory, and all these wacko names. But maybe that was one way of memorizing them, because they were such crazy names, right? You don't remember a genealogy with all the normal people in it. So, you remember all the crazies. But, yeah, not much else to say about chapter 10. Okay, chapter 11. This is the last chapter I'm going to read today, by the way. Chapter 11. The Tower of Babel. Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. As people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. And they said to each other, "Come, let's build bricks and make them thoroughly. They used brick instead of stone, and tar for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves, because we will be scattered over the face of the earth." But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. And the Lord said, "If as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language, so they will not understand each other." So the Lord scattered them from there all over the earth, and they stopped building the city. This is why it was called Babel. Oh, sorry, I lost my place. Verse 9. And that is why it is called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there, the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. Okay, the last part is genealogy, but before I talk more about genealogies, well, it's not that long of a genealogy, but I do want to talk about the Tower of Babel. And even though it's a pretty short story, it does have some interesting elements to it, which I do want to talk about. So we're going to cover them quickly. First, obviously, the Tower of Babel does that whole annoying. Here we're telling an earlier part compared to other parts of the Bible. So in chapter 10, you may have observed that when it talks about the descendants of, Noah's sons, and how basically they built their own little clans, and then their clans spread out to different parts of the world, and each clan had their own language. But of course, chapter 11 tells about a time where everybody had the same language. So it's obvious that the Tower of Babel takes place before, the whole, here's the descendants of, the three boys, right? So it's one of those narrative things that's super annoying to read. But we probably do this all the time when it's like, storytelling, right? Because I'm pretty sure when a bard probably told the lineage part in chapter 10, but then of course, you have to fill in gaps that you jumped over, which is, well, before there were Noah, his three boys, right? Probably all spoke the same language. But then all the Noah's sons have sons of their own, and they build their own communities, even cultures and nations essentially. But then all of a sudden they all speak different languages. Well, what happened, right? Why do they all speak different languages? And so the Tower of Babel story probably tells, well, this is how that part came around, right? So yeah, the Bible does that annoying thing where it tells an event and then it has to go backtrack a bit in time to tell you how something else came to be, instead of simply just assuming that, okay, people would have just developed different languages over time or something, right? Which would not have been an issue. It could have just been what happened when people separate. But of course, that is also another important theme in the Tower of Babel story, which we will get to in a second. The other thing that's kind of interesting to talk about in the Tower of Babel story is the part where in verse 5, it talks about how God comes down and he looks at this town, right? The city that they're building. And he goes, wow, humans are actually capable of a lot, If we left them to their own devices, there's nothing they couldn't do, right? Because I guess humans are far more resilient and they're pretty powerful when united. But at the same time, I kind of want you guys to spread out, once again, making the Tower of Babel story a prequel to chapter 10, right? Because chapter 10, all the descendants spread out. But in chapter 11, it's this whole well, everybody wants to stay together. So it's pretty obvious that it's doing one of those narrative things of telling a later story. Sorry, telling an earlier event in a later story. And so, this is funny part where God's just like, wow, humans are actually capable of a lot when they work together. But you're kind of not doing what I told you to do. So I'm going to force you guys to do what I told you to do by confusing your language. which of course some people may call that kind of a very mean move by God, right? For him to just be like, hey, you're supposed to do this, so I'm going to make you do it. Um, but it is interesting that God even points out the power of human beings, if you will, right? And of course, it's not like, I think the point of that, if you will, is to kind of say that, like, you know, humans should not be so haughty and thinking that, well, we've always thought we were powerful because we're human beings, but rather we're powerful because God has always acknowledged that we are powerful, if that makes any sense. So basically, because God said so, it makes it an undeniable truth as opposed to something that, like, well, we eventually could have come up with this idea ourselves. It was an idea that God always had when he saw that human beings were building the Tower of Babel. And he's like, human beings are pretty powerful. And there's nothing they can't do if they put their heads together. Which, brings people to wonder, what would the world be like if humans actually could do that? Because, of course, as we have seen, even up to now, human beings can't do that. Um, you know, all unite as one nation, really. But, of course, there's another implication of this as well, right? That what people should be uniting under is not something we make ourselves, but what should be uniting people together is our identity in God, right? Because there's the whole image of God thing, um, and even Jesus prays for the unity of his people. But it is under our identity in God that we should be united, as opposed to a self-made identity, which is another reason, perhaps, for the whole splitting up everybody, um, and stopping the whole Babel thing, right? There is one more thing I want to address, and it has nothing to do with what exactly is written, but it's the way I pronounce it. I say Babel, and the reason why I say Babel is because this makes me sound like such an elitist, and I should probably I should probably whip up something on my computer to show you the actual Hebrew text, but I suck at editing. So, but in the Hebrew text, if you look up the word for Babel, it's actually like the letters, like the B, and then there's this like a breathing mark, which is like similar to an apostrophe, basically. A breathing mark, and then BL. Remember, because, ancient Hebrew didn't have vowels. So it was B apostrophe BL. And so the apostrophe, the breathing mark, is kind of to split the word, right? So you don't say like, it's not a double B, right? It's not like, how would that actually be pronounced? BBL, if it was one word. Um, and even if we put vowels in it, like our makeshift vowels, it would be like, what kind of word would that make? It would make like, if it was B. I'm trying to remember a little bit of the Hebrew that I know. But once again, like, I'm trying to craft a word here, because I don't think there is an actual word. That's just BBL, um, without the breathing mark. But if there was a word like that, it would probably be something like, well, basically where we get Babel, right? It'd be like, because the second BL would have to be slurred as one um, sound, as opposed to the BEL that we get, right? Because it's the way that the scripting would work if you had the BBL as opposed to B breathing mark BL, because you're supposed to see as a one syllable word. So it's like bab or something like that, right? But that's not a real word. So, um, but by making it the breathing mark makes it two syllables. So the first B is just its own sound, so it's ba, and then the B L would make the second B has to imitate the first B, so it's another B A and it has an L, so it's Babel, right? Or Babel, right? But basically, it's not Babel, or, well, I guess Babel would be close, right? But it's like Babel. Um, or Babel, something like that. But basically, I break up the BA from Babel, because in English, this is kind of where we get the word Babel from, right? In the English language, we invented the word Babel out of this story, and of course, in the Hebrew, Babel means confuse, right? So when we use that phrase, "stop your babbling," it means, when we're talking about the word Babel means confusing language, right? Like stop talking confusing words is what we mean when we say stop your babbling, right? And of course, because so much of language is developed from these ancient stories, right? And we develop idioms and metaphors based on them. And so um, this is why, calling it the Tower of Babel would be an adequate translation. And then of course we made a word based on that, right? You're babbling. But anyway, I just wanted to cover, like, before all of you go, why do you pronounce Babel that way? It's Babel because of how the script is, and that's how ancient languages are. And I want to try and sound super smart by using the more ancient pronunciation as opposed to like our modern pronunciation. Of course, if you call it Babel, that's completely fine. That's how we would pronounce it as moderns. But I remember when I was younger, just on a side note, that everybody would pronounce it Babel, the Tower of Babel, and I used to think that was weird, um, because once again, there's the English expression that we use, stop your babbling, um, which once again, if we're basing it off this story, then you should pronounce those two words the same way, right? So if if it really was called the Tower of Babel, we'd say stop your babbling, which doesn't quite have the same ring to it, I guess. But Babel is an adequate pronunciation. So just because I pronounce it because I'm an elitist and pronounce it the traditional way of Babel, if you pronounce it Babel, completely acceptable. I mean, I will sometimes still call it Babel as well because it's easier to say than Babel, right? So, uh, but that's why that's why it's actually pronounced Babel, by the way, because I want to sound cool and say it how it's actually pronounced. But as a modern person, I will say Babel from time to time. But anyway, that's the last thing I want to talk about, the Tower of Babel. All right, let's speed through this last part here, starting from verse 10. So this is an account of Shem's family line. So 2 years after the flood, when Shem was 100 years old, he became the father of Arphaxad. That's an awesome name, Arphaxad. And after he became the father of Arphaxad, Shem lived 500 years, having other sons and daughters. When Arphaxad had lived 35 years, he became the father of Shelah. And after he became the father of Shelah, Arphaxad lived 403 years and had other sons and daughters. So once again, exceptions to the rule, because apparently these guys are living for a couple hundred years. But I guess they still have that magic blood in them still or something. I don't know how the magic blood thing works and how it wears off. And I mean, what decides it? Does God just arbitrarily pick it? No one is sure. It's just one of those weird things that you just have to accept that we don't know. And understandably why people think that, the Bible has a lot of fictitious elements because of stuff like this. And I can't blame you at times. Because, yeah, here's one of those weird quote unquote contradictions. And you just kind of have to be like, well, magic world interpretation, I guess. No other way of looking at it. If you have a better answer, I'd love to hear it. But that's the best one I got, so. Anyways, verse 14. When Shelah lived 30 years, he became the father of Eber. And after he became the father of Eber, Shelah lived 403 years, having other sons and daughters. And when Eber lived 34 years, he became the father of Peleg. And after he became the father of Peleg, Eber lived 430 years and had other sons and daughters. When Peleg had lived 30 years, he became the father of Reu. Reu? Reu. This name has always been annoying. R-E-U. I think it's Ryu. Because you're supposed to slur the E and the U. You don't go like Ryu or something. It's Ryu. I think. Anyways, after becoming the father of Ryu, Peleg lived 209 years and had other sons and daughters. When Reu lived 32 years, he became the father of Serug. And after he became the father of Serug, Reu lived 207 years and had other sons and daughters. When Serug, he lived 30 years, he became the father of Nahor. And after he became the father of Nahor, Serug lived 200 years and had other sons and daughters. When Nahor lived 29 years, he became the father of Terah. Oh, thank God for a relatively easy name to pronounce. And after he became the father of Terah, Nahor lived 119 years and had other sons and daughters. When Terah had lived 70 years, he became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Because, of course, this is where it starts, guys. The tradition I will make fun of a lot when I read Bible stories. And that is, what is up with these guys? Why does every family have to have a junior? Be more creative in naming kids. And here is where it begins. So, yeah, Nahor decided to name one of his kids after his dad because he couldn't come up with a better name after all these other creative names that they had. No, he had to name one of his kids after his dad because I guess he was just too lazy to come up with something better than Nahor. But anyway, you will definitely see me rant about this way more when I read the Gospels because the Gospels are notorious for like this guy and this family had like this junior and then these families had like that junior and that's why there's like 5 Simons in this one place, 4 Marys in this other place, and like, come on guys, like you gotta have better naming conventions. This is where it starts, right here. Tara, you ruined it. You ruined everything, Tara, with this whole junior tradition. Why? Why did you do this? Damn it, Tara. Anyways. And after I just gave him, like, the praise of having the most normal name. I guess it's the price you get for normal names. You don't want to go outside of the comfort zone, so everybody gets normal names, but there are only so many normal names you can use that you have to keep using them. Good job, buddy. Anyways, let's finish up here. Verse 27. This is the account of Terah's family line. So Terah became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran became the father of Lot. While his father Terah was still alive, Haran died in Ur of the Chaldeans, in the land of his birth. Abram and Nahor both married. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai. The name of Nahor's wife was Milcah. Milcah was the daughter of Haran. Yeah, so funky things are starting here because human beings. It didn't take long after Noah for things to go south real fast. Incest jokes. Insert here. Milcah was the daughter of Haran. I guess when Haran's already dead, he can't object to it. But anyways, the father of both Milcah and Ishka. Now Sarai was childless because she was not able to conceive. So Terah took his son Abram, his grandson Lot, son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, the wife of his son Abram, and together they set out from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. Terah lived 205 years, and then he died in Haran. And that's the end of what I plan on reading today. So, not much really to say here. Genealogies. But as you notice, guys start living a lot shorter. It's like Shem lived a pretty long time, but then by the time we get to like, you know, Serug and Terah, they only live like a couple hundred, which is still a pretty long time. And one of the funny things is that Abram himself will live a pretty long time. There's also the funny thing where we have a weird time confliction, and that is when Terah lived 70 years and became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. I think they did the poetic thing of putting Abram first because Abram would be the important one. But from context, I actually think the opposite is true. That Abram is the youngest of the three and Haran is the oldest. Now the reason why I say this, and I might review this again if the topic comes up in like later chapters, because obviously we go into the Abraham story next, and so Abram, later Abraham, the Bible says that he starts the journey at roughly like almost 100 years old or something like that, right? But if that were true, then if he was the oldest son of Terah, then those numbers contradict each other. So if Abraham started traveling at 100 years, then Terah would not have died at 205. He would have died at roughly 170 years old. If he was the oldest son, because Terah had him when he was 70. But this is probably not the case. When it said that Terah was 70 years old, I think it just mentions that he had his three sons, as opposed to like, I don't know, maybe people in the ancient world were weird and decided not to have kids till really late, which is weird because why would you not be having sex earlier is my big question for people like that. But that's probably me thinking about that kind of thing a bit too much. But anyway, because the implication is that if Haran is the oldest and Terah waited till he was 70, like, dude, what are you doing? But like, I assume Haran is the oldest, and this is because of the whole like Nahor, the middle kid, I assume. Because it's more than implied that Abram must be the youngest. But Nahor marries essentially his niece. And this may work age gap wise. Whether whether we can condone incest or not is, well, obviously we can't because God doesn't condone it later on. But human beings are messed up, so they're gonna do it anyway. All puns intended, I guess. But the implication is that Haran died by the time his younger brother got married. So maybe Haran is way older than his brothers, and maybe Haran had kids early. Because we read some of these other guys like Nahor, Grandpa Nahor, as we will now call him. Grandpa Nahor had his first kid. He was Terah's dad at the age of 29, right? So quote unquote relative. Well, 29 is relatively early. Maybe not for ancient world, but for modern people, 29 is definitely early. But Terah said that he waits till like he was 70. Like what? But anyway, going back to the brother Nahor, Abram's older brother, I can assume, marries essentially his niece, unless there's another Milcon that we don't know about. That we're talking about two different Milcons, but the Bible doesn't suggest that. So incest jokes, here we come. You can leave yours in the comment if it's burning you that much. YouTube might strike you, but I might get a good laugh out of it. Because I'm always down for some dark humor. Because I'm sick like that, you could say. Anyway, so going back to the whole Haran, Nahor, and Abram, and Haran being the oldest, because he's dead by the time his daughter gets married to his brother. So he might be a lot older, and he may have only lived like a quote-unquote relatively normal human lifespan. Because compared to all these other guys, he's dying pretty early too. So maybe he died. I mean, the other explanation is that he could have died in like a fight or something, right? That's also possible. But the Bible doesn't tell us that, so we don't know, right? But this middle brother here, marries essentially his niece. So why I assume Abram is the youngest is because, once again, if he was the firstborn, his age would not line up with other parts of scripture that we read. So the implication that he's the youngest and that Haran was the firstborn when Terah was 70, and maybe the Bible just didn't want to bother telling you when each one was born and how long it took. Just said, well, let's just say, Terah started having kids at 70. Once again, what are you doing, guy? That late? But you know, and then he had 3 boys, and he started at the age of 70. I think that's a more accurate way of reading that. Now, I know some people may think that I'm kind of copying out what may be an apparent contradiction, but once again, oral story tradition. You don't want to say like, well, let's backpedal a bit. So throughout all the other genealogy parts, right, it just says at this age he had this one particular kid, right, and so the number only shows up once, right? At this age, so and so had this kid, right? But because in the story of Terah, the Bible, and as well as anyone who would have told the story, needed to start doing some world building, because of course Abraham is going to be a major character, so you got to do some world building. And so on the one hand, you want to keep the oral tradition of the way we've been telling genealogies. At this age this guy had so and so, but at the same time we need to do some world building. So we need to say that Terah had 3 boys because all of them actually have some importance, right? Because Haran does have some importance in that Haran has a son named Lot, and Lot is going to show up too, because Lot is actually he's a not an important character, but he's around, and he does have some narrative significance. So Lot's going to show up. So Haran has to be mentioned. Why Nahor is mentioned, we're not 100% sure. I think this is something I think, and it, you take this with lots of salt, not just a grain, but with lots of salt, because this is just me guessing, based on what the Bible doesn't say, right? So it's not indicative of a good hypothesis, if you will. But basically, the contrast of Abraham and his 2 brothers is that Abraham is actually kind of a failure. He's the little brother that's basically been coddled, I think, is kind of the way the story paints it. Because Haran, he has all these kids, and he gives his wealth to his son Lot, right? So obviously he's somewhat of a success. And then Nahor may be a success, quote unquote, because he moves out. And so the implication of what makes me think that is because Abraham, in his old age, is still living with his dad, right? And he's so much of a failure that even though he's married, him and his wife have to live with his dad, because Abraham is the failure. Of course, the reason why I think this is, one, he has no kids, and that's a big part of ancient culture. Even if you start late like Terah did, you want to have kids at some point. But Abraham fails to have kids, right? And it's because, as the Bible tells us, Sarai just couldn't conceive for whatever reason, right? But Abraham's kind of a failure. He's the failure of the family, and that's why he has to stick with his dad. He can't move out. He can't be his own person. But of course, you're going to run into the big contrast real soon, right? But unfortunately, I'm not going to start reading that until next week, hopefully, because my work schedule came up and I am working overnights. So we'll see how my stream schedule will be. But with that being said, an easy way to keep up is just to follow, subscribe, hit that notification, and you'll be notified when I do stream. Before I do a reading stream for sure, I will do the StarCraft stream. Like, that one's the more iffy one, whether I do a Throwback Thursday. Because I like doing them. And then usually, like I did yesterday, I did announce that I was going to do, today's stream. So another reason to, if you subscribe, and I know like the notification thing's not perfect, but like, you might catch the StarCraft stream, or even its playback. Excuse me, I'm hiccuping for some reason. The playback of the StarCraft stream if you subscribe, and then of course you can get my announcement of me doing the next reading stream, which I will try to do another reading stream next Friday. Maybe a little earlier than I did today. I know I started a little late today because I had to run an errand. Well, technically, I rested for half an hour after running an errand. So, but I could have. I know some of you may say, well, you could have just started streaming right away. But after running an errand, I want to sit around and do nothing for half an hour because I'm like that. But that's besides the point. But next Friday, I'll try and do the next reading stream. And I will talk more about the whole like Abraham as a failure thing in more detail. That's kind of why I brought up the whole next time I'm streaming. But back in, just to finish off chapter 11, what's his face? Terah, he wants to go on a little adventure, but he's like super old and dies during it, right? Or he settles down because he kind of figures, well, I'm too old to be doing this. And then he dies in this place called Haran. Well, very similar name to his son. There's Haran, and then there's Haran. So, anyways, Terah then, dies in this one place. And then, of course, that is also where the next part will pick up, because it's important to mention that Terah dies because, Abraham being the failure of the family and has to rely on his dad for so much. And even when his dad dies off, he doesn't get much of an inheritance. Once again, this leads me to believe that Haran, it's kind of hard to differentiate Haran and Haran, the place. But Haran, the son of Terah, he must have been the one to get the inheritance, because we later see that Abraham's nephew Lot is actually pretty wealthy. He has like his own livestock and stuff, whereas Abraham doesn't have any of that until later. So Abraham is this leads me to think that Abraham was like the family failure. But there is, with that being said, there is obvious, we're reading the Bible here, and we're gonna jump into the Abraham story next week. Something's up, right? When chapter 11 paints Abraham in this way as the family failure. But I will definitely dive in a lot more into that next week on, Streaming Parson Reads Genesis. And I will start from chapter 12. And I hope you guys will come for that. But with that being said, I am going to end the stream here. I thank you guys for coming and, listening to me read/rant as I do. Especially when you got to read a lot. I mean, what was this, like 6 chapters in one go, as opposed to like last week I did 1. So thank you for being patient with going through 6 chapters and moving fast like that, right? It can be a lot of information. I know I threw a lot more information today as well, because I wanted to cram these chapters and move on to Abraham next week, because I didn't want to spend like 2 weeks reading like Noah and all that and the genealogy stuff. I kind of wanted to move through that fast so we could do more, in my mind, more interesting parts, right, of Genesis. And Abraham is definitely the crux of that more interesting part of the story. But anyway, thank you all for coming, and I hope that you will be here for next week's streams. I will try to do Throwback Thursday, but once again, overnight work may make that a little tight. We'll see. I did find yesterday, so maybe we'll do the same thing I did yesterday for a Throwback Thursday next week, as well as next Friday for a reading stream. And I guess with me working full time again, it will be tough. Those are the only streams I have kind of planned out for now, right? Throwback Thursdays playing StarCraft, and of course Friday streams doing some reading. If I ever find more time, which is tough with working 5 days a week, because basically I'm spending the 2 days I'm not working for streaming. And I know some people would be like, but you should take a Sabbath. That's a biblical concept. But I kind of treat the StarCraft stream as like my Sabbath because that's me just doing whatever I want, basically. Um, so with that being said, though, I hope you guys will tune in next week for next week's set of streams, even though there's only going to be 2 in the foreseeable future for each week. I know I want to do more Switch. I want to go back, play more Tokyo Mirage on stream because that's another fun game I like playing. But that one is kind of up in the air because I have to work so much. But for sure, next week there will be a Throwback Thursday, and then, well, I'll try to do the Throwback Thursday because that one's like the tighter one to squeeze in. And next Friday I will be doing another reading stream. But with that being said, I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Have a great week, and I will see you next week for Throwback Thursday. Have a good day, and God bless.